Lines that are parallel have the same gradient. You can see here that the pink, aqua and blue line are all parallel to each other. In other words, they stay the same distance apart from each other forever and ever. Let's look at their gradients. Remember, the gradient is the thing with x. So here, look what's with the x. In front of the x appears to be no number, but if there's nothing there, it is a 1. So the gradient of this line is a 1. What's with the x here? A 1. And what's with the x here? A 1. They all have a gradient of 1, and they are parallel lines. That hopefully shows you that parallel lines have the same gradient. So parallel lines have the same gradient. So let's look at an example below. It wants us to show that the line AB and CD are parallel. It tells us that A is -1, -5, B is 5, 7. So it wants us to find the gradient of the line joining A and B. It wants us to find the gradient of the line joining C, which is -3, 1, and D, which is 4, 15. It wants us to find the gradient of the line joining C and D. And it wants us to show that AB is parallel to CD. So if they are parallel, they will have the same gradient. So let's work out the gradient of AB. We write down our gradient formula. I then substitute in. So I'm going to call this x1, y1, and this point x2, y2. So y2 is 7, subtract -5. x2 is 5, and I'm going to subtract -1. So that is, when I've got 7 subtract -5, that gives me 12. 5 subtract -1 gives me 6. So the gradient of a line joining AB is 2. Let's look at the gradient of a line joining CD. Again, we write down our gradient formula. We label the points x1, y1, x2, y2, and we substitute that into our formula. So y2 is 15, and we then subtract 1. x2 is 4, and then we then subtract a -3. 15 subtract 1 gives me 14. 4 subtract a -3 gives me 7. That has a gradient of 2. Both of those lines, the line going from A to B and a line going from C to D, have a gradient of 2. They have the same gradient. If they have the same gradient, the lines must be parallel, because parallel lines have the same gradient. So we would write AB is parallel to CD, as they both have the same gradient, which happens to be 2.